Weights can lie to you, specifically the number that's printed on them relative to the challenge that's supplied to your muscles. If we took this 25-pound dumbbell and held it down by our side, there's little to no challenge to the biceps. However, as soon as I flex my elbow, it gets significantly more challenging. Now, unless this is a magic dumbbell, the weight didn't change. So what did? Well, in one word, torque. Torque is the foundation of all human movement, not just weightlifting. So if you can begin to understand this and then see it in the gym, you'll be able to apply it to train yourself and others so much better. This is the fundamental bedrock that everything else is built off of. So the aim of this video is to break down what torque is, how we see it in the gym, and how we can begin using it to make more educated gym decisions. My name is Amir Barber, I am a chemical engineer, and today we are discussing torque. So first of all, what is torque? Quite simply, it is rotational force. It is not that difficult of a concept to understand. And we all inherently have some understanding of it, which I will show you later. You already know torque, okay? But why does it matter in the context of the human body? Well, all of our joints are actually just rotational axes. If you take my elbow joint, for example, let's just use this guy right here. That's me. All right. If you take that, for example, we can call the center of this elbow joint the pivot, and we are just rotating about it. So if I drew a line as to where the weight traveled from, it's part of a circle. This is just a rotational axis. We rotate about our elbow. We also rotate about our shoulder. You could draw a circle with my hand, and your knees, and your hips, and your ankles, okay? They're all simply rotational axes. And all movement is fundamentally rotational. So if we look at my hand, for example, you might say, hey, you just moved that thing in a straight line. Yes, the net outcome was my hand moving in a straight line. However, it came from my shoulder rotating and my elbow rotating. That combined rotation produced straight linear motion. So quite literally every movement that you perform is rotation about your joints. So if we want to describe the challenge associated with that rotation, we have to use torque, which is rotational force. Every time you move, but also every time you lift a weight, you're applying torque to joints externally. And then internally, your muscles will generate torque in response to that resistance. And that's how we fundamentally train muscles. Now, the equation for torque is equal to linear force times the moment arm. And don't worry, we're not actually going to do any math with numbers. What we care about is trends here. And honestly, it's gonna be a lot of drawing. So if you're arts and craftsy, you should get the hang of this real well. Okay, but drawing the moment arm and then the line of force will tell you what torque is. And we're gonna go through a lot of examples in which we draw these things out. Again, ignore the numbers, it's just about the trends, okay? So before we get too far down the rabbit hole and start talking about actual exercises, let's take an example that we all understand, or we've all probably used a wrench at some point in our lives. So the goal when you're using a wrench is to either tighten or loosen this nut. We're trying to have a rotational force happen over here by pushing somewhere over here. Okay, but let's ignore that for a sec. And let's agree upon the fact that we're trying to rotate about this axis. This would be the center of rotation. So if the whole thing moved, this point wouldn't. Okay, so that is our axis. Okay, now let's just consider that we push right from here. Let's ignore this hand over here for a sec. And let's say we were smart cookies, so we pushed straight up. And most people would just instinctually understand that they should be pushing with this direction. So boom, we just drew our line of force. Okay, and let's say we're pushing with 20 pounds of force. Again, numbers don't necessarily matter, but this is just for example purposes. Okay, now we have our line of force drawn, we see where our axis is, and from here, we can start drawing the moment arm. Now, what the moment arm is, it's an imaginary line, but it is the perpendicular distance between the line of force and the axis. So we have to draw a line that connects these two things. And the one rule that you have to follow is that when this line that goes through the axis hits the line of force, you form a 90-degree angle. Now, this green line is our moment arm, okay? So let's just say that we decide we grab this in this first scenario 1 meter away. And over here, we're gonna push in the same exact direction. We drew the line of force again. Okay, we have the same axis, but let's draw our new moment arm. So we would know, since it's basically the same, that our new moment arm is twice as long in this second scenario. So if we double the moment arm, then we doubled the torque, assuming that we are pushing with the same exact force. And this is why when you grab a wrench, you don't grab it from right here. You go as far as you can this way so you can gain leverage, increase the moment arm, so that you can supply torque with the same, if not less, force. Okay. Now, one more scenario I want to consider here, let's ignore the second hand, is let's just say we have this same line of force that we had and the same moment arm, okay? But another person comes along and maybe they don't really know how to use a wrench. So instead of pushing straight up on this guy, they start pushing at this angle, right? So how does that change the torque? Okay, if we remember our rules for drawing a moment arm, I have to connect the line of force to that axis and also make a 90-degree angle. So what that would look like is boom, right there. Now, as you can see, this moment arm compared to the new one we have is much lower. So if we decrease the moment arm, then we decrease the torque. All right, so that's just something to keep in mind. The direction of the line of force fundamentally changes the amount of torque that you generate because it changes the moment arm. So that's just the drawing rules. Now we can actually jump into fun exercises, and we'll of course start off with a biceps curl. Okay, so we start off with the dumbbell down by our side, and we're gonna just draw the center of the elbow joint because that's the axis. Okay, so this is the axis that we're going to be drawing. And then here's how you draw the lines of force for a free weight. It's always straight down due to gravity for any barbell or dumbbell, okay? So if we go ahead and try drawing a straight line, and you can extend it into infinity either way, so draw it as long as you want, but we have this little moment arm right here. Okay, so it's about yay big. All right, now in the context of this scenario, in these free weight scenarios, the direction of the line of force is always the same. And the magnitude of that force is also always the same because it's a 25-pound dumbbell the whole way through. So the only thing that changes is the moment arm. So essentially, when we're using the same dumbbell throughout the whole range of motion, torque is proportional to the moment arm. So if the moment arm goes up, torque goes up. If the moment arm goes down, torque goes down. All right, so let's just continue through this range of motion. Okay, let's say we get to right about there. Okay, so now we have a new line of force. Let's draw this in blue because we're fancy. Okay, let's say it's right there. And now we can draw this new moment arm, which is about twice as long, right? And if we continue through the range of motion, right about here, then let's say we have, I'm running out of colors, all right? So now we have a new line of force that's right here, and again, this moment arm extended by this much. So if we were to graph this out, we went from here to here-ish to here. So we have this part of the curve already mapped out. Okay, but as we continue going further through this range of motion, let's say when we're up here, the moment arm actually drops off again, right? Because again, let's draw it. So if this is now the line of force, okay, and we're going to here, so after this 90 degrees, it drops off. So peak torque occurs at 90 degrees. So the load that your biceps have to manage throughout the range of motion and all of the elbow flexors has to do with this curve. The weight's the same, but the torque has changed. So your elbow flexors have to work hardest right here, okay? So that's just an example of how we would draw moment arms for free weights and a biceps curl. But let's drive the point home. Let's go to a dumbbell lateral raise, okay? So let's start right at the beginning, all right? So this initial, again, this line of force, here's the center of my shoulder joint, which is the axis, okay? This is the line of force from the dumbbell. So it almost, if I were to draw that better, it would pass straight through it. So if it passed straight through it, it is basically zero. It is essentially zero. So let me get out of the way so you can actually see this, all right? But the moment arm, if we wanted to try drawing it, it's next to nothing, right? It's very, very, very small. Okay, so what happens as we continue going up through the range of motion? Let's stop right about there, okay? Now we have another one. What color should we do? Let's do red. That seems like a good. So now this new line of force is red. We have to draw an imaginary line, the moment arm, to connect the axis to the line of force. So that's what it looks like. And then as we get up to 90 degrees, here's our new line of force. So the challenge to the deltoids was basically zero in the beginning. And then when we got to this 45-degree point, climbed up here, and it continued climbing. So it's basically something like that. So as we lift the weight up more, it gets more difficult. Your deltoids have to manage more torque. And we all instinctually understand this. If you saw somebody take 50, 60-pound dumbbells and do this, not very impressive. If you see them do this, I mean, that's a freak of nature right there. Watch out, run the other way, okay? But this torque helps us tell the story of where the load is most difficult and where the exercise is most difficult, okay? And now let's make things interesting. Let's take other forms of resistance into account. So we'll start off with the cable lateral raise, if I can get it to just the right spot. So now things start getting fun. Let's consider the same exact movement pattern. We are just changing from a dumbbell to a cable. Now, cables are unique in the fact that the line of force, the direction of it, changes throughout the range of motion. So really easy to draw. It's just in the same exact direction as the cable. So down here, that's the line of force. And if we were just to extend it out all the way, here is our axis up here. So right off the bat, we have a huge moment arm. In fact, this is where it's maxed out. Now let's continue going through the range of motion. Right about here. Okay, now we have a new line of force. And we have to connect it to the axis. So that's our new moment arm. It shrunk, okay? And as we continue going up, let's say we get to, again, this 90-degree spot. Here's the new line of force, roughly, okay? And then, I didn't draw that very well. I'm redrawing it. Here's the new line of force. And then, boom, Okay, and see how we're making right angles. That's what the moment arm has to be. Okay, so it went from a very big moment arm to smaller to smallest. So if we were to graph it, this cable lateral raise has the opposite trend as the dumbbell raise. And that fundamentally changes the exercise because we are challenging it, in this case, in the lengthened position, and in this case, in the shortened position. When your muscle's all bunched up and shortened, that's where it's the most loaded. And down here, we are loading the stretch, which changes the movement. But wait, there's more. So all of the movements we've discussed thus far have been around single joints, or we've only really been considering single joints. But what happens when we start talking about compound movements, where multiple joints are moving at once? So in this same example from earlier, this is the same motion, right? My hand looks like it's moving relatively linearly. However, I have two joints that are rotating. So let's talk about both the shoulder and the elbow joint, all right? Stick with me here. Okay, so we have one axis right about there, and then we'll call that the center of my shoulder. It's really hard to actually determine where the center of the shoulder joint is, but let's call it that. So right now, this initial line of force, when we're at this top position, is next to nil, right? Like those are the tiny little moment arms, so it's almost zero, okay? But what happens as we continue progressing through the range? Let's stop right there. All right, now the line of force has moved out to here. So let's change colors. So now the line of force is right there. So there's demand on the elbow joint and more demand on the shoulder joint. All right, so we're trending up. All right, and as we continue through the range of motion, right here, let's draw a new line of force. And I'm gonna go on this, I'll go on this side. Again, we've increased and we've increased. Now this explains why the bottom of the press is more difficult than the top. Because at the top, our joints are all stacked. The lines of force are basically running through the axes. So it's not very difficult up here. And again, this translates to a real gym experience. Again, if you see someone do this with 200-pound dumbbells, you're like, cool, I guess. But if you see someone do this with 200-pound dumbbells, much more impressive. Okay, and the reason being is torque. There's so much more torque in that bottom position. But essentially, the same line of force, you can draw multiple moment arms to the different joints that are being affected to determine how much torque is at those joints. I'm going to drive this home with the next example because this is where things start getting powerful and you can start making gym decisions based off of this. All right, let's jump right in. So if you didn't know about torque, you would just consider these two movements, a Bulgarian split squat hits the same muscles, right? But these subtle differences in form can drastically change which muscles you're actually biasing. So this starts playing into actually making gym decisions, okay? So let's consider the two axes of the hip and the knee joint. And let's just make things really simple, okay? The knee joint, what's gonna control the knee joint is essentially the quads, all right? And what's gonna control the hip joint is the glutes. Now, there are more muscles involved than just those two, but we're making things simple, okay? So in scenario A over here, I am more leaned over. So the center of mass of my torso is more leaned over, but let's just consider the weights that I'm holding. The weights are over here. So if I were to draw this line of force, it would be something like that. And over here, I'm a little bit more upright and I'm holding the weights close to my hip. So I already kind of drew the line of force over here, but let's draw it again. There's the line of force over here. Okay? Now, let's draw the moment arms to the knees and to the hips. All right, so in this case, we have this much to the knees, this much to the hips, Those are our moment arms. And over here, we have a very small moment arm to the hip and a very large moment arm to the knee. So by altering the exercise in this way and being able to see this torque, we can determine, since this moment arm is bigger, remember, torque is equal to force times the moment arm, okay? And we have the same force in both scenarios. We're holding the same weights, all right? So the only thing that changes is the position of the force and therefore the position of the moment arm. All right, so if we have a bigger moment arm to the knee, that means the quads are going to have to work harder. And if we have a smaller moment arm to the glutes, it means that the glutes are going to have to work less, because the glutes will manage torque at the hip joint and the quads will manage torque at the knee joint. All right, and similarly, it's the opposite case over here. This would be more of a glute biased exercise because the moment arm is bigger to the glutes. So you see how just starting to see this in the gym can make you make sense of exercises. And this is just the 101 side of things. If you dive into some of my other videos, I will talk about torque and resistance profiles at length, okay? And just to make things clear, I kind of snuck this one in. When we were drawing, let's say, the resistance profile or when I was drawing this line, that's the resistance profile. That is how the torque changes, the external torque changes throughout the range of motion. So you just learned what a resistance profile is. If you just chart out how much torque there is at different points in the range of motion, you now have a resistance profile, which is very powerful information later in our next series where we talk about internal moment arms. And this is where we're gonna wrap things up. So everything we talked about thus far has been external load and external torque. However, that weight will supply external torque and your muscles will generate torque internally. And moment arms are just as important there, and this starts getting anatomy involved. So this is the next layer deeper. And when you can combine external and internal resistance, you end up with a very powerful set of skills to determine what exercises actually are and be able to see things in 4 dimensions, okay? So in this example of the biceps curl, we have 3 muscles that flex the elbow, or 3 muscles that we're gonna consider here, okay? We have the brachioradialis, which is this hunk of muscle. It attaches here and goes down to near your wrist over here. Okay, and then we have our brachialis, which is a deep elbow flexor muscle. And then we have the biceps that we all know. And they run in different directions. And each one of them has a moment arm, which is how much leverage it has to perform the movement pattern. So we're only scraping the surface here. We're not gonna get deep into it because that has to be a whole other video. And if you go look at any of the master classes I have, we talk about internal moment arms at length, okay? But in this case, at this specific joint angle, the brachioradialis has the most leverage, the biceps have the second most, and then the brachialis has the third most. So it's in that order. But if we were to put the arm down here, we'd find that that relationship changed. So if we know the resistance profile, and then we can understand how the internal leverages change, that is how we can conclusively target muscles with specific exercises. But again, that is for another video. I hope you enjoyed the topic of torque today. I hope it has you thinking and trying to see these lines of forces in the gym. And if you have any questions, drop a comment down below, subscribe, and just let me know what your thoughts are. Peace.